very happy to be here to welcome Dr. Thomas Murphy, S.J. Tom and I go way back, well, pretty 15, 16 years. We lived together in 22 years to be exact, thank you. We lived together in Berkeley while we were in studies. Tom is a professor at Seattle University, associate professor at Seattle University, and he was born in Winthrop, Massachusetts, entered the Society of Jesus in 1987, and did a Master's of Philosophy here at Loyola University during his scholastic period. So he actually he's one of our alumni here, 1991. He did his PhD at the University of Connecticut, and his dissertation was on Jesuit slaveholding. He was ordained in 1999 and has been at Seattle ever since then. Mostly, Tom's research and scholarship is in the history of religious liberty, especially in the Anglo-American tradition, and also the history of the American-Canadian border, kind of borderlands history. This we thought was a very timely a moment to bring Tom out here. Tom's own scholarship was a part of the whole Georgetown kind of reflection and engagement with their history. So without further ado, let me welcome Tom up to the lecture.
Thank you, Mark. Mark was my house coordinator when we lived together in Berkeley, but I still speak to him. So I want to thank him for his service to me during that time. And let me say also how very glad I am to be back here speaking as an alumnus, 26 years after the fact. I'm going to ask you today to bear with a somewhat cynical thesis that I will present to you and then unfold. And then hopefully after about 45 minutes, we can discuss some of the implications for it. I'm going to ask you to begin by imagining two documents in U.S. history, which you might have read. Thomas Paine's Common Sense and Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. I refer to the Declaration of Independence in particular because people often refer to it when they question how could slavery have ever happened in the United States? How could a nation that proclaimed in its founding document that all men are created equal, making that a universal statement, have gone on to continuing and to enslave African Americans for another 90 years and discriminating against them for many years beyond that? I think the clue lies in Thomas Paine's Common Sense, which not only provides a clue to the Declaration of Independence, but also to the motivations of the Jesuits. There's a very cynical theory that has been circulating for several years now in professional scholarly circles about the Declaration of Independence, that the universal values proclaimed in the preamble were not so much a philosophical statement as an appeal for allies. And here's where Paine comes in. In Common Sense, he says the key to the United States achieving its independence against the global superpower of the day, Great Britain, is to cultivate allies among the various nations of Europe, all of which, he said, would want to trade with the very lucrative American market. If you could get all these nations together to support American independence financially and militarily, then there would be a chance of together defeating the British superpower. And so this theory goes on to say, Jefferson took some rhetoric which during the earlier stages of revolutionary discontent had been expressed as the rights of English people and made them universal for the sake of appealing to these potential allies. In other words, if you want the Dutch or the French or the Spanish or some of the other powers of that time to help you out, you find a way to suggest that the ideals being fought for would apply to them as well as to you. So you simply universalize it. You don't say these are English rights, or you don't say these are American rights. you say that they are universal rights. And during the decades that followed, many Americans probably continued to think along those lines, that their freedom was more important than anybody else's freedom. And I think the Jesuits of Maryland, which is the group that I'm talking about, were so interested in obtaining and securing their own religious liberty that they were not willing to look at the implications of their slaveholding. If you go back to the days of St. Edmund Campion in the 16th century, he found himself up against an English government that denied that people who were Catholic could enjoy any of the usual civil rights of an English subject. He went to his death in defense of that belief. He argued that religion should be a matter of individual freedom, and it should have no effect whatsoever on one's civil, legal, or political status. The Jesuits who came to Maryland about a half century after his death had the same philosophy, that they could continue practicing their Catholicism and at the same time have all the civil and secular rights of Englishmen. At the time, this meant primarily the right to own property. Colonial Maryland was an agrarian culture, an agricultural economy. If you wanted to get ahead economically in that colony, you had to own land, and you had to have people to work the land for you. Originally, this was done by indentured servants, but by the end of the 17th century, it had given way to a slave system in which the Jesuits fully took part. The earliest written documentation of a Jesuit owning a slave is in 1717. This practice continued until the Jesuits sold their slave en masse in 1838. After 1776, of course, the United States emerges as an independent country, which relatively quickly writes into its Bill of Rights the freedom of religion. But the Jesuits in Maryland continued to be insecure about the guarantee of this right. They continued to watch very carefully to see if it would be honored in the case of Catholics. And so they continued to assert their right to be property owners. They looked at the issue of abolitionism and they related it to nativism. They noticed that many, though not all, of the people who favored abolition were also talking about restricting immigration from Europe. And in many cases, this would mean restricting Catholic immigration. So just because the United States had become independent and broken with Great Britain and established formal religious liberty did not mean that the Jesuits felt secure in that regard. How did the Jesuits come to obtain their slaves? There are all kinds of ways this was done, but a great many of them came their way by gift, by benefaction. People who wanted to support the church in Maryland during colonial times found that a good way to do that was to offer their priests some servants. That way they'd be able to continue on the land and have a place where they could base themselves for the performance of their sacramental ministries. It was felt they needed to have plantations and farms in order to carry on the sacraments, in order to carry on any kind of contact with their flock. And so many of the slaves came by gift, and few questions were asked about where the people giving the gift had got the slaves in the first place. They made a very clear distinction between slave trade, which they and the church technically condemned, and slave transaction. If you obtained a slave from an individual who was offering you one, either as a gift or for sale, you could do that. You wouldn't buy a slave directly from a slave trader, but you could take one from a member of your flock. There are other reasons that the Jesuits didn't look squarely at the slave problem. One of the most important is the internal politics of the church during that era. In 1773, the Jesuits were suppressed worldwide. They were restored in Maryland in 1805. They were restored in the rest of the world in 1814. During the time that there was no Society of Jesus in Maryland, those who had been members of the now suppressed society were still priests, and they still felt a sense of responsibility to carry on their ministry. The suppression did not deprive them of their sacramental ordination, which was for life. And they felt a sense of responsibility to their flocks and continued to feel that they needed to be based on farms and plantations in order to carry out that responsibility. Furthermore, in 1789, they created Georgetown Academy, the forerunner of today's university. And at the time, the laws of the Society of Jesus specified no tuition should be charged to students. I bet all of you would love to go back to those days. But that put a further burden on the plantations and farms to provide enough revenue to keep the school going in a context where there was no tuition coming in. Furthermore, once the restoration of the society began, the Jesuits were determined that such a thing never recur. So they thought very carefully about wading into controversy. They didn't want to get involved in the debate over slavery because they thought that might produce a backlash both from the state and from the church. So they avoided the issue of emancipation for the most part. It took them a long time until the 1830s to even come up with a suggestion to Rome that it might be appropriate to emancipate the slaves. During these years, they questioned how they ever got involved in slavery in the first place, but did very little about it. A couple of other things to bear in mind about internal church politics are that Jesuits in Europe split during the French Revolutionary era into two factions. There was an Anglo-Irish faction and a continental faction. Both parties had representatives on the faculty at Georgetown in the early 19th century. For the most part, the Anglo-Irish Jesuits welcomed the American Revolution, particularly in its political form. They didn't necessarily believe that it extended rights to everyone in the world, but they did feel it secured their religious liberty and the religious liberty of all Catholics in the United States. So they were very supportive of what they considered to be the revolution's best result, the American Constitution, a document which, of course, sanctioned slavery as well as religious liberty. The Continental Jesuits were another matter. Most of them saw a revolution through the eyes of the French version of it. Many of them had fled Europe for their lives, had ended up in the United States as refugees. They weren't very comfortable with the idea of a nation based on a revolution even though the American one was a very different child than the one they had fled in France. So they were suspicious of movements for social freedom. They would be suspicious of emancipation because it would suggest the liberty, the equality, the fraternity that they had heard so much about in France and felt they had suffered so much from. And there was a great deal of quarreling on the faculty of Georgetown about this issue, and some of the Continentalists ultimately migrated west to create the Jesuit presence in the state of Missouri. So I think in the interests of keeping fraternal order within the Society of Jesus in the United States, the society sort of made a decision that it would support the political outcome of the American Revolution, but reject the movements for further social reform. That by doing this, you could get the two sides to come to a compromise and live in some kind of harmony within the order and its various projects. Also want to mention some theological reasons why the Jesuits resisted the idea of ending the institution of slavery. One of them was that they had no sanction from the Universal Church to move in the direction of declaring slavery an absolute evil. That doesn't happen until 1889. So when they consulted the church that had so recently restored them, for advice on this matter, it was pointed out to them that the tradition of the church was that slavery was mentioned without condemnation in all parts of the Bible, that most people who were abolitionist were Protestant, that this might be a continuation of what they saw as the heresy of the Reformation. Many of the Jesuits observed that it was an interesting phenomenon that many Protestant theologians spoke in terms of Martin Luther's belief in Scripture alone as the source of doctrine, but then contradicted that very same Scripture by saying that slavery was morally acceptable. Also, when they looked at the philosophical tradition of the church, they saw approval for ancient philosophy, for Augustine, for Aquinas, and very little to be said in favor of the Enlightenment philosophies, or philosophers of which the society was increasingly wary. So there's an enormous amount of intellectual and, I think more significantly, emotional resistance to the idea of moving towards emancipation. Let me say a few words now about how slavery eventually came to an end in Maryland. It's a process that takes about 20 years. It began soon after the worldwide restoration of the society in 1814. When the society began reconstituting itself, it was very eager that there be order and form and discipline in the way that the various institutions and landholdings of the society were operated. And Rome was very aware that the Jesuits in Maryland had essentially spent 30 years as an independent entity. During that time, they had organized themselves with the state legislature as a business corporation and simply operated the places according to their own rules and guidelines, how they saw it best. Rome was aware that for the most part this had held the landholdings together, but they wanted to reincorporate it into a global system. So in 1820 and again in 1830, they sent a visitor from the Society's Curia in Rome to come and look over the plantations and see what might be done to run them better. This was an Irish visitor, Peter Kenny. And it was the result of his two visitations that really kick-started the momentum to get out of the slavery business. And I think there were several factors at work in what he observed. First of all, he thought it was a morally dubious undertaking, that it wasn't edifying for the faithful when they saw Jesuit priests and brothers getting involved in the government of slaves, particularly anything that involved corporal punishment. He's much more discreet about this next point, but he also seems to have had a fear of the possibility of sexual liaisons between Jesuits and slaves. He also thought that this was a potential source of scandal to non-Catholics in America, that if they wanted to kick up a fuss against the Jesuits in the United States, they might start criticizing their slaveholding and the style with which they conducted it. He also felt that this was a tremendous drain on the economics of the society, that Jesuits, for the most part, were not good business managers, that the farms were in perennial financial trouble. Now, many people looking at this point would say that, of course, plantations would be in financial trouble. The slaves weren't cooperating with the system, so they weren't productive. That is not the way Kenny interpreted what was happening. He thought it was due to the managerial incompetence of the Jesuits. And he didn't see an easy way for the Jesuits to solve that problem. So he gradually moves towards the idea that they should get out of slaveholding. But then he makes what I think was a mistake in terms of persuading Jesuits in the United States that this should be done. He was asked to report on how he thought the conditions of the slaves themselves were. And his conclusion related to Rome was that they are not treated well, but they are still treated better than any Irish tenants are treated at home by the British. So he thought the situation was serious, but not yet dire. And this was seized upon by defenders of slavery as an excuse to keep the institution going. As the 1820s and 30s continue, there was pretty much the split of the Maryland Jesuits into three factions regarding slavery. The first and the smallest was supportive of emancipation. They favored a gradual approach to it, where there would be some preparation made for freedom before they were actually set free. But they did see the value of setting the goal of letting them go free. There was a second group that said we need to continue what we're doing. These slaves have been presented to us by God. We need to keep them. We need to govern them. They need our guidance. They need our assistance. They need our management. The report on slavery at Georgetown believes that that's quite likely was the largest group among the Jesuits. And then there was a group that favored selling the slaves. And this was led by the most controversial figure in the whole thing, Father Thomas Malady, who as provincial would lead the actual sale of the slaves in 1838. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about his motivations. When he approached Rome and started discussing with Rome what should be done, Rome had some preference for emancipation, at least in the gradualist model. But he persuaded Rome to let him sell the slaves under certain strict conditions. Malady apparently believed, correctly, as it turned out, that the focus of the American Catholic Church in the coming decades was going to shift to the cities. He foretold the growing immigration from Europe that was going to come over and settle largely in places like New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Boston, the big cities of the Maryland province as it was then constituted. And he felt that the Society of Jesus needed to prepare for this by shifting its ministries away from the countryside to the cities. So his goal was not only to get rid of the slaves by sale, but also to sell the land itself. And he eventually talked Rome into this point of view. In 1838, he succeeded with the first. He sold the slaves. He was not able to succeed with the second because he ended up being removed as provincial because of the way he sold the slaves. As I said earlier, he was given very strict instructions by Rome as to how he was to carry out the sale. And one of those instructions was he shouldn't invest any money from the sale of slaves into development at Georgetown itself. It was felt that because this money involved the sale of human beings, the only proper disposition of the money was to offer it up to the church itself. So the money was to be put into a special arca for the training of future priests. Milady disobeyed this injunction and invested some of the money in construction on his campus. It is for this that he was removed from office. He was called to Rome to explain himself, and after a period of exile in France, he was sent back to the United States, where he founded my undergraduate alma mater, Holy Cross. And he seems to have been sent there as a bit of a punishment. That was considered one of the most nativist states in the United States at the time, and it was thought this would be a place where he might struggle a little bit and have a chance to further reflect upon his disobedience. That's the thing he gets nailed for, his disobedience. The result of his fall from power is that the people who come into power in the Maryland Jesuit province after him did not carry through the second aspect of the project. They did not sell the land. The land remained in the hands of the Society of Jesus well into the 20th century and ended up being operated by tenant farmers. Still a great many African American laborers, but it all headed in the area of sharecropping after 1838. The Georgetown Report emphasized that I stand in the tradition of a first wave of scholars on this topic, mainly Jesuits who wanted to find out how the Jesuits thought about slavery, and more particularly, how they resisted the idea that it was a completely immoral institution. There has been, since the publication of my book in 2001, a second wave of scholarship, which has focused more on tracking the descendants of the Jesuit slaves who were sold in 1838. We believe that there were at least 272 people who were sold. That's what we have in the written record. It's generally believed, and probably is so, that there were more than that. We don't know a whole lot about that generation that was actually sold. We know that their fate was very tragic. The church had specified that they could only be sold to Catholics and that they could only be moved to other plantations in circumstances in which families were not broken up. The church was very strict that husbands, wives, and their children could not be pulled apart for the sake of a slave sale. By 1838 in Maryland, it was very, very difficult to keep families intact by keeping them within the state because the number of slave laborers that individual owners had fallen to quite low numbers. So the momentum of that requirement led the Jesuits to seek new buyers in the state of Louisiana, where there was still large-scale slave labor, particularly in the sugar plantation industry. And that is where the slaves first went. It was promised by the two partners who bought them that they would keep the group intact, that they would keep them on the same plantation and promote their Catholic culture. 10 years later, a Jesuit from Georgetown went down to Louisiana. It seems to have been mainly out of personal curiosity. He was not a formal visitor, but he went down there to try to track what had become of the slaves, and he discovered that their new owners had run into financial problems and then had broken all the agreements they made about keeping the group intact by dispersing them among numerous new buyers. And after that, the first generation kind of falls out of the picture. There is, however, a growing amount of very promising scholarship that is based on the oral histories that are being increasingly relayed to us by people who claim descent from Jesuit slaves. When I did my dissertation, I focused on the written record, but I think there is a growing trust among slave scholars now that we can trust the oral histories that have been handed down generation upon generation. And I recommend the New York Times series that was done about a year and a half ago, where the reporter did a marvelous job of tracking down a lot of these folks. And I look forward to meeting many of them at a conference at Fordham University in New York in April. Final thing I'd like to focus on is the voice of the slaves themselves. When I was researching the dissertation, I did not find any writings that were directly attributable to Jesuit-owned slaves. I did quite frequently find quotations made by Jesuits in which they said this or that slave said something. My dissertation director didn't really trust these comments. He said you can put them in the dissertation if you want, but since they're coming to us secondhand, we can't generally be sure that these reflect the actual voices of the slaves themselves. But let me tell one story that was preserved in this manner. Jesuits of this era practiced what they called the discipline, which was an ancient practice of religious in the church of self-flagellation. They would whip themselves as a punishment for their sins, particularly their sins of lust. Slaves were fascinated by this phenomenon for the obvious reason that they spent most of their day trying to avoid occasions of being whipped. They have no say in the matter, so the idea of someone who might do that voluntarily is quite startling to them. And there was a slave woman who heard rumors from some of the other slaves that the priest whose plantation they were working on would go to the barn at night to administer his discipline. And she decided to sneak into the barn to observe whether or not he actually performed this rumored ritual. So she hid behind a bale of hay, I suppose, or some other tool in the shed. He came in, he took off his shirt, he began whipping himself. She stepped forward and said, "Father, don't do that to yourself. Don't hurt yourself. Jesus doesn't want you to do that." He became very angry at her for interrupting his prayer and then turned the whip on her, which was a violation of what Father Kenny had specified the Jesuits should do. They weren't supposed to whip anybody, least of all a slave woman. And also, there are numerous accounts of Jesuits complaining about the lack of industry of their slaves. They would issue complaints such as somebody told me he was going to take 2 hours to bring the produce to market and it took him 5, or someone promised to have something done by the first morning after and it was not done until the third morning, and so on. The Jesuits often interpreted this as a lack of industry or a manifestation of laziness. I think today we see these more as signs of rebellion. These were people who were not working at their own initiative. They were not working for their own benefit. Of course, they would not have been eager to complete the task in a hurry. So we know that there was resistance on the part of the Jesuit slaves. Sometimes the Jesuits rationalized that the slaves really loved them. For example, during the War of 1812, a group of British ships appeared in the Chesapeake Bay and tried to seize some of the slaves and promised them freedom if they would come with them to Nova Scotia and then fight on the British side in the war. The slaves, for the most part, said no, and many of them found a way to run away and return to their plantations. The Jesuits' interpretation of this event was they really love us and they appreciate our care. They don't want to leave us. I think it's more the case they simply didn't want to go to a foreign place. I mean, even though they weren't free, they considered Maryland their home, and I think they were opting for their homeland rather than for their masters. So we know that there was resistance to the Jesuit slaves. Those who are telling the story now, the descendants, are stressing how loyal they have remained for all these generations to the Catholic faith. And that points to the one bright spot on which I can conclude, and that is the Jesuits, while they were paternalistic towards their slaves, did believe that they were worthy of Christianity. Not every Christian religious denomination at the time believed that slaves were worthy of baptism, but the Jesuits did baptize their slaves. They did provide them with oral catechesis. They didn't necessarily teach them to read and write because that would have been against the law, but they did pass on to them the faith. So orally, that was passed down by the subsequent generations, and these people have kept alive a vivid sense of their Catholic experience between 1838 and the present. And I hope that that will continue to be a fountain of scholarship during the time to come.